Welcome to The Currency of Grief, the podcast where we confront two of society's most taboo topics, death and money. My name is Justin Weidenfeld, and I'm here to serve as your grief financial officer, guiding you through the complex and emotional journey of what happens when money and mortality collide. Whether you're navigating the aftermath of losing a loved one, looking for practical advice on handling pre- and post-death planning, or simply just wanting to start those hard conversations about legacy while you still can, this space is for you. Together, we'll hear real-life stories from real-life people who have navigated the intersection of grief and money and come out the other side. Our guests will share their stories, practical insights, valuable advice, and moments of clarity so that none of you have to navigate this alone. I'm grateful you've decided to join us on this journey. Now let's dive in. So without further ado, let's meet our guest for today's podcast. I am humbled and honored to be joined in the virtual studio with Wendy Wright. Wendy is a financial therapist, a money coach, and a wealth transfer communication specialist based out of Denver, Colorado. Wendy has her master's in marriage and family therapy and became a counselor with a unique perspective on the emotions around money. As a specialist in wealth transfer dynamics, Wendy created a communication matrix she uses to help facilitate communication and connection amongst family wealth transfers. I met Wendy when she presented at the FPA Next Gen conference in August in Orlando. And during her presentation about how to help families navigate a wealth transfer before and after it happens, she put up two quotes that stuck with me ever since. The first one is 80% of people who inherit wealth say it's more of a burden than a gift. The second one is maybe stolen from Ramit a little bit, but it's common for people to leave an estate plan with no clear inheritance plan. After her presentation, I ran up to the stage to introduce myself, and I knew she had to be on the podcast. So, Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Justin. I'm excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you. From that moment I heard you speak at FPA Next Gen.
Yeah.
So, Wendy, when I told you after you spoke, when I told you about the podcast, besides me asking you to come on, what made you want to come on the podcast and share your story?
Mm. Well, I think you sum it up well when you talk about the fact that these are two things very avoided, money and grief. And this whole area is so um, uh, unspoken of, I guess we could say. That's not really the right verb, but um, and so the more we can talk about how to talk about it, the better. Money is so highly avoided, and the my research and my understanding and my personal stories with clients of the transfer of resources is so under talked about, and it's actually very painful. It's not like a big, great prize that you get when you inherit some resources, inherit wealth, when it's not been talked about. So it really helps for us to talk about it. And then also, grief is a big part of money work, not just the grief from the loss of a loved one. So I think we can talk about that some more today as well.
Definitely. And it's so evident that from your presentation and from our conversations that people don't have the tools to properly navigate complex financial and that like emotional burden of inheritance. And that's really what stood out to me from our conversations in your presentation.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so easy to avoid it. It's uncomfortable, it's uncertain, and oftentimes there's people will say things like they don't know where to start. They don't know how to have the conversation. They don't know how to manage if there's any conflict. That and all of that just leads to avoidance feeling a lot more beautiful, but not
Yeah.
helpful.
Well, I just love talking about it. All those taboo topics. Let's
Hmm.
just talk about them. And hopefully
Hmm.
you'll get that from the two of us today. So, but Wendy, I know from reading your bio, you weren't always a financial therapist. So tell me a little bit about your path to becoming a financial therapist and a money coach, and what made you focus on wealth transfer.
hmm I was, so I've been a therapist for about 25 years, and I was most recently part of the specialty of financial therapy. I'm an eating disorder specialist, and it was working with eating disorder clients at higher levels of care who were very limited to what they could and couldn't do during the day because they were in a day program or an overnight program, that I began to notice some very interesting acceleration of other behaviors, we'll call it, such as shopping, gift giving, or talking about how little money they had when their families would come to me and say, oh, she has X number of thousands and thousands of dollars in her account. She just won't touch it. And I
Wow.
began to see these different themes and patterns. And because going back, now I'll go back before I go forward. Going back, my undergrad was in business. I was in mortgage banking and had businesses and flipped houses and things like that. So I had this comfort with talking about money that I'd say the majority of therapists do not. And I'm not bad mouthing them. They would tell you also that they don't like talking about money.
That's
In
fair.
fact, therapists will send their clients to me for the money talks because they're like, I'm not sure where to go with this. So sometimes I'm working alongside another therapist working on other issues. So I literally got really curious around, hey, there seems to be a real connection here between money and emotions. This was about a decade ago when the word financial therapy, the niche was really in its infancy. The Financial Therapy Association was really new. And I found the more I began to really look into it, the more I really aligned with it and understood it and wanted to do more of it. So my private practice at that point, when I stepped into private practice, has been pretty much exclusively financial therapy now for almost a decade. It's really
Wow.
powerful. It's very healing.
That's amazing, and I think it says a lot that other therapists, a, don't want to have the money conversations, and b, want to refer them to you, who feels comfortable in the mud in having those money conversations. And then
hmm
also your comments around grief. There's more than just the grief of loss. There's grief in all other different spheres of the
hmm
world, including with eating disorders, I'm sure, and your other places of work. So typically on the podcast, we start with the grief and the emotional side of loss. And so tell us, I don't know, maybe the top three things you've learned when it comes to grief and loss through your work.
Yeah. One of the most powerful themes that I've learned that I see over and over and over again, even just this week in client sessions, it's so constantly there that grief is, uh, it's not necessarily avoided, it's more of not even seen. Somebody may be really grieving, for instance, a divorce is a lot, there's a lot of grief around a divorce. So I'm going to use that as an example, maybe. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of financial grief, or perhaps, let's think back to 2008 comes up for a lot of my clients, depending on how old they were or what happened, the losses that they felt. And sometimes even though they have numerically uh, come back from those losses, they have mathematically restored themselves, they still have this sensation of fear and being stuck there as if it's going to happen again tomorrow. And so what will happen when there's untended to grief or blocked grief of some kind? We don't know it, we don't see it, we don't feel it.
Mm.
So then we begin to operate out of this level of disconnect from our emotional self. When we begin to see that part of this is grief, then we can begin to work through, the common stages of grief we've heard of: shock, denial, anger, sadness, bargaining, and acceptance. In each of those phases, you will have certain financial money behavior patterns. But if you don't connect the two, then they live in a lot of disconnect, and it's really hard to begin to shift those patterns because it doesn't, it's like when we say, I keep doing this, I don't know why I keep doing it, kind of a
Yeah.
feeling. That's what's happening. So when we can name, okay, there's some grief here. It's been said up to 90% of our financial decisions are emotionally based, and a good portion of that. I mean, if you think about it, grief encompasses a lot of the feelings wheel. So there's a lot of ways in which each of those can be part of a grieving process.
Yeah. Is there, and no is a perfectly good answer for, but for each stage of grief, is there, a common action or reaction from a financial standpoint? So if it's
Mm.
shock, do you then go out on a spending spree, or get, like, want to just go out and buy something new to change the shock to happiness?
Well, it depends, of course, is
Okay.
the overall answer. Let me tell you a little bit of how I describe this. When I so when I began to see from working with eating disorder patients and began to see some of these money behaviors overlap, then I began to speak on this, and I because I like to call this the intersection of money and milkshakes. So there's a real overlap between food, body, and exercise behaviors and money behaviors. One of the ways that I use to describe this is we tend to go to either highly rigid behaviors or highly chaotic behaviors. So if we use that sort of continuum, each phase of grief, so you might be in shock and denial, maybe if your brain chemistry tends toward highly rigid behaviors, then you start counting and you build extra spreadsheets and you don't spend any money and you're stacking it, stacking it, stacking it almost with a hoarding energy, because hoarding energy is usually anxiety or fear based. So it's like, shut it all down. Let's just do this and don't ask me any questions. Leave me alone, like all of that. But if it's highly
Yeah.
chaotic, then yes, it may end up in spending, not even know what you bought. It may be some other kind of risky behaviors, things like that too. So it can look that way. It can look that way during anger, during sadness, during bargaining. Bargaining often looks like what I will rephrase as justification loops of,
Mm,
I need to do this. This is going to make sense for this. It's where each spending decision or money decision lives in isolation of a bigger
okay.
picture.
So now when we talk about loss, like the loss of someone
Hmm.
that you love, what are common spending or financial patterns that come from that?
Yeah, again, that can go one way or the other. Shut down, lots of shutdown, which is kind of begins to look like that old saying we have of putting the money under the mattress. So
Yeah.
for those clients, often I will find they have hundreds of thousands of dollars in a checking account, uninsured, over the insurance limits and this kind of thing. It's just there, and it's been sitting there for months and months and months because they just can't do, don't know what to do with it. So it sits there. And, or perhaps it starts to, um, there's a lot of avoidance and perhaps it starts to float away because again, they don't want to touch it because they're not through going through the grieving process. So one of the things that I encourage right off the bat is safety, like have the money in a safe place, but then also pausing,
Mm,
allowing the space. And this is kind of tricky when you think about it's a kind of a both and. There's pausing that you might do with the big picture planning, and there may be bills that need to be paid yesterday or like there's bills that need to be paid. So when we talk, I think later we'll talk maybe more specifically about setting up an estate plan and inheritance plan and things like that too.
yeah.
You want someone to be able to pay the bills, and also you don't want to have to make any big decisions.
So do you typically recommend specific time frame of people to pause before making any major life decisions?
Yeah. This one might be surprising because ideally, I'd like them to wait a year. There's a
Mm,
lot of this going through all the seasons of life. I mean, literal seasons of weather, but also like holidays, birthdays, all of those kind of things of life. Um, as they begin to map out a plan, but not making any major big decisions in the meantime. Now, sometimes decisions have to be made. Sometimes maybe a house needs to be sold or things like that too. But ideally, it would be
mm,
really nice to wait at least several months, like to
yeah,
really catch your breath, because grief actually can take 2 to 5 years to really fully process and flow and go through all that. And we make different decisions when we're in the midst of, especially really heavy, deep grief.
yeah. And someone say we're always grieving.
Absolutely. I mean, we can, we're going into fall here. If summer is your big favorite season, there's grief, there's a sense of loss. Sometimes
Mm,
grief actually literally lasts 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 days. It's whenever you notice yourself kind of, oh, I'm just rolled through denial. I don't want to pull my jacket out yet because I'm not ready for it to chill out. Or then anger, sadness, despair, and then you put your coat on. Okay, maybe that took a minute, but that was a mini grief cycle. And I find it really helpful for us to see, oh, because one of the scary parts about grief generally is, oh, if I go there, I'm going to get stuck. So the more we can see that we grieve regularly and at all kinds of different paces, the less scary it can tend to be.
mm. And I've said this on a couple previous podcasts, but at experience camps, we call it getting stuck in the mud, sitting in the mud, getting stuck in the mud.
Yeah,
It's sometimes you need to be stuck in order to get unstuck. You need to realize that you are stuck, you are grieving
yeah.
before getting unstuck. And so when somebody is grieving, how do grievers typically make decisions? And are there any like stories that you could share about,
Mm,
someone making decisions too quickly or it going right, really, like people waiting a year to make the big decisions?
hmm. Yeah, let me go at it this way. I just recently heard Jean Chatsky of Her Money podcast, like she used the stat that 40% of money that is received in a transfer goes poof in the first year. And I that to me is so aligned with grieving because there's such a level of disconnect. So there's a lot of spending that can happen that's not connected to anything other than trying to get through the moment, or maybe um, this is what uh, whoever gave them the inheritance, this is what they would have wanted. This is what was important to them, or it felt like a good deal at the time. It was maybe on sale. Like we all have our sort of like markers of what makes a quote unquote good money decision. So a lot of those will just show up sort of in default. So it's a lot of disconnected spending. Can also be shame. If there's any amount of shame involved in someone's money life, which statistically there's quite a bit, that blocks asking questions. And so if someone's really overwhelmed with grief already, that makes asking questions difficult because it's kind of hard for the brain to actually come online and form a question that makes sense to someone.
Yeah.
And so, and that's, I think, what's helpful for financial planners who are involved on the other side of the desk for this to sometimes understand that sometimes a blank look on your client's face is actually the brain grasping for phrases to make sense of a question. And so there may be ways in which you can guide someone to the question, for one. So what I will tend to see is money will begin to disappear because of the level of disconnect, whether it be disconnect from an overall plan, disconnect from anything that person wants, disconnect from the ability to ask questions, things like that.
Yeah. Two scenarios have come to my mind, both, well, One is a former guest on the podcast. She and a couple of guests actually have inherited money from their spouse, like a life insurance check.
Mm-hmm.
And there's shame around having money in their name now,
Mm-hmm.
but it's from the death of their husband and being maybe financially free, and it's from the death of a spouse. And
Yeah.
then for me personally, I had shame that, I inherited over $1 million when my dad passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I was 21 years old and I didn't know a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know the difference. I had to learn the difference between an ETF and a mutual fund. And
Right.
as a young man who, chest out, broad shoulders, is trying to kind of put my bootstraps on and navigate life, it's shame to be able to there was shame to be able to ask those questions
Mm-hmm.
and find someone who I trusted to ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so there may be shame around the person who's not there, and shame around what you know and what you have. And so if you are grieving and going through and making financial decisions, as well as have received some money, are there tools or strategies that can help grievers make better financial decisions?
Yeah, you're talking about a couple of different scenarios here. So let's talk. I'm going to split up into two
Yeah.
scenarios. For instance, one is, and this is a little bit that matrix you were talking about too. We tend to either have expected or unexpected inheritances, and we either have discussed or undiscussed. Undiscussed is that a word, but not talked about.
Yeah.
um, you know,
Sounded good to me.
right? I liked it. So when we have, for instance, if an inheritance is expected and talked about, that's ideal. Like, here's what it is. You're able to, and you don't even necessarily have to talk about the numbers. That's real important for our tools of how to talk about it. You don't have to talk about the numbers for quite a while, because what we're really talking about is energetically what is being transferred, who is the team to talk to, and also helping that person become aware of what role would they want it to play in their life. You know the role, if you're the giver, you know the role that it played in your life. Maybe the role it played in your life was accumulation, and maybe
Yeah.
you were a hardcore accumulator. But then when you're handing a bulk of resources to someone else who's not, for instance, an accumulator, and or maybe they don't need to accumulate anymore because, as you know, for those, you may have talked about this before too, like at a certain point, money makes a lot of money. So there may not really be a role of accumulation anymore. Maybe the role is um, disbursement or something
Hmm.
like that. So beginning to talk about that, we didn't have to talk about any numbers. We're talking about energetically, what role do you want this to play? Here's the role it played for me. What role do you want it to play for you? Then we want to look at that with if it's expected but not really talked about very clearly, that is um, kind of creates that sense of burden that people will talk about, like, or kind of magical thinking. Oh, if someone says, don't worry about it, you'll be taken care of, but there's no clarity of what that means, then the receiver is going to make certain decisions. Maybe they don't save as much of their own money because they think this large amount's coming and it's actually not that large, or different things like that too. So we want to be able to increase that communication about it. But then there's this other side of it's not expected. Sometimes loss is sudden and there is no
Hmm.
warning, and often in those cases too, the giver hasn't had the time. Maybe they intended to set up a plan, but they haven't had the time because it was a shock. And so there's this, sort of, it was unexpected, it was undiscussed. So in that particular case, we want to again encourage to take the pause, take a little time to grieve, make sure the money is safe, and the resources are in a safe place. but then also allow yourself some space and time to go through your emotions and grieve them, and then begin to ask yourself the question, uh, two key questions. Who owns this money, and what story do you want it to tell?
Mm,
Starting with who owns this money can really be healing as you come into, regardless of the source or the how the money came to you. Establishing a sense of ownership can help you settle into making decisions that are aligned with your system, with your nervous system. And in a lot of ways, that's the way I state the goal here. We want to tap into your own intuitive self so that you're making decisions that you feel relatively comfortable with, both small picture and big picture. So by beginning to ask that story of, or that question of, whose money is this? And sometimes that takes months to really align with, okay, now it's mine, kind of
yeah.
feeling, and
I mean, for
acknowledge
me,
that.
it's taken years. Like, this was always dad's money. And then
Right.
I started earning and putting the money in the same account. And I'm like, I don't know what's dad's money and what's my money anymore.
Right. Exactly. And that's, I mean, I appreciate you sharing that. It's very vulnerable because I think then you can probably trail out. You make different decisions if it feels like it's dad's money or my money. So that's why we want
Hmm.
to like really come into whose money is it? And there's actually no right or wrong answer to this either. I have 10 principles of financial therapy, and I always say the first one has to come first, and that's that we look at this with abundant, compassionate curiosity and zero judgment.
Love that.
Zero judgment. So it's really powerful because we are often trained to be very judgy and brutally judgy, to ourselves about money and to each other. So coming at this
Hmm.
with that kind of level. The other one is that a plan is only as good as the adjustment process. So often when I'm working with people one on one, I will tell them the first thing we're going to work on here is your adjustment process. And that's kind of your communication with yourself, or if it's a partnership, your communication with each other, and also your communication with your past, present, and future self, because they're all involved with money decisions. So, in other words, we really want to look at this because um, there really is no future that is unadjusted. Like we will
Mm,
always face financial adjustments. So, the more comfort we have with this, the better. So, those are two principles that really come into play here as someone begins to figure out what they want this money to do. So the other question is, what story do you want it to tell? And by bringing this more into a narrative, less of a spreadsheet, I often find people are able to come to some sort of like vision or picture of what they would like it to do. Then we begin to look at the numbers. And what will happen then, sometimes the numbers, if sometimes the inheritance seems like a lot of money, but when we really start playing out the numbers, it doesn't go as far as people thought it would. And that's helpful. Sometimes it
mhm.
goes way farther. Sometimes, this person's very new to money and they didn't really understand the power or like how it can grow and things like that too. So we begin with no judgment, compassion, and curiosity. We move into um, how will the plan be adjusted? Then we move into, okay, what story do I want it to tell? Then numbers.
Hmm. So I love that. So you're talking about, what does the mountaintop look like? What story do we want this money to tell, to be?
Hmm.
What do we want our money story to be? And then as we're going towards that mountaintop, how do we just adjust along the way? And there's no
Hmm.
right, no wrong answers. And then we take back, we go, and then we kind of start on the path and we say, all right, what path do we want to take? What is the actual strategy, the plan, the numbers, and do all of those things line up?
Yeah, yeah. That's a rough sketch of what I have
Mhm.
typically found to be helpful. Yeah.
That's super cool. I love
Hmm.
that. Um, so putting you on the spot here,
Hmm.
why does why do people feel like inheritance is more of a burden than a gift?
Right? I know. I mean, I
Because you have to do all this work, and I'm like, instead of just go to work, go to sleep, eat dinner,
right.
all that.
So many reasons. I'll share a few. Some we've already talked about. For one, grief takes years. And so if you think about that too, then for the first 5 to 10 years, well, let me start by let me go back. Uh, One of the ways that I describe money is that it is a decision making process, which is another one of my principles is to take the money word out of the sentence. So instead of saying I'm stressed about money, we want to say, what are you stressed about? And often, so often it's, I don't know, I don't want to fail. I don't want to hurt someone. I don't want to make a mistake. A lot of decision making
Mm-hmm.
and energy. So when we're looking at that, and if someone gets, say, $1 million for, just to use that as an example, mathematical number, every one of those dollars could potentially have a million decisions made about them. In other words, the exponential deposit of decisions, especially if nothing was talked about or planned, is so huge that sometimes it's really just hard to figure out, remember to brush your teeth that day. Like it's just, so that's one of the reasons that it can be a burden. And one of the reasons why I like to help people talk about ways to pre-decide stuff. So then there's a lot of stories, clients that I've worked with, stories you've probably heard of the amount of financial chaos that they run into. Perhaps taxes haven't been filed. Perhaps there's properties without property taxes paid. There's like, and often what has often been the case is that particular, so it was a parent or even a spouse, if the money was not talked about between the partners in a marriage, which often happens, and we want to keep that not happening, but um, it may have looked like everything was smooth sailing. And then when you actually pull out the paperwork, the level of chaos is stunning. And then there's like anger, like, how could they leave me with this? And then it's also very isolating. This is extremely isolating because, for one, it's really hard to say, and I have a lot of clients that will say this as well, that maybe they've gotten a couple of $1 million. There is no one to talk to about this because their friends who didn't get a couple of $1 million will often say something along the lines of, nice problem to have, wish I had your problem, which
Yeah.
is, it's a normal human response. But also what we want to be able to say is, okay, I hear that I hear that that's hard. We just want to be able to
Mm.
shift that dialogue. And so it's isolating. It's really isolating. And also, um, you're making a lot of decisions at this point, essentially kind of for the loved one you lost, but not really for them anymore because they're gone. And so you're trying to assimilate these decisions into your life. So those are a few. I don't know if that brings up uh
100%.
okay.
So I think one of the things you mentioned earlier of your question of who owns this money,
Hmm.
you're kind of in that in between phase where you
Yeah.
it, or even if it's a home, who owns this home?
Oh
Well,
gosh.
the person who owns the home may not be here anymore. It may
Hmm.
actually be my home or the inheritor's home, but
Hmm.
it's not my home. I wasn't living there. Maybe I lived there as a child, and my parents still had that childhood home, but it's not my home anymore. But then I have to do everything for it. And
Hmm.
so why is inheriting a house so much of a burden?
Right, right. Yeah. Inheriting a house is, in my experience, um, not that simple. In fact, it's pretty complicated, and especially if it wasn't talked about. So, and this is another place where when I come in to help people talk about this, I want the giver to talk about, what are you wanting to energetically give here? Perhaps it is housing security. And maybe that person already has housing security, but to the giver, this home represented housing security. Or, like
Hmm.
we really want to say, what are you trying to energetically give? then we can begin to say, okay, well, does this resource, whatever it may be, match that energy? That is very helpful because otherwise, what happens is for anyone who's had a house, um, anyone who's even rented a house knows this too. Like, you never know when something can go wrong. And then you've got to, if you're renting, you can call the landlord, but then the landlord's got to vet 4 providers potentially, like you want to interview a few people, repair people who are going to fix the problem, or you didn't know the problem, or I remember from the days of flipping houses too, you want to look, even when I bought and sold houses, you want to look under the foundation. Like you want to look at like not just do you want to change the paint color, but how are the pipes? How are, all these kind of things that may have not been done, especially if it was a home of aging parents, because
Right.
their decline in their ability to take care of the home is often hidden as they are dealing with their own aging.
Agent. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of complication with this. What looks simple on the outside, I want to give them a home, quote unquote, this place. But if it's not talked about and not planned for, it can be such a headache, such a burden.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about my grandparents, mm, that their homes, and it's like, oh, this house is amazing. Like, you should never get rid of this house,
Hmm.
And you may have a child who lives in Denver, Colorado, and the house is in Florida, and it's a burden to keep, and you have to have
Yeah.
someone to manage it or someone to fix the toilets when it goes wrong.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Especially if there's what would you say if they're like house poor or house
yeah,
rich, cash poor. That's what I'm looking for here. Because if you're going to give someone a house, you also want to make a plan to give them enough cash to maintain the
hmm,
house for, let's say, at least 2 to 3 years, because I just layered the grieving process over that. So,
right.
to really think that through, even simple things as far as like paying the utility bill can be really complicated. And
Yeah.
so having things like that preset and because it's
Uh,
all about who's on the account and powers of attorney and all those kind of things come into play with the house.
I'll tell you a specific story. So my grandma passed away in August, and I'm the
Mm,
executor of her estate, and so I'm in charge of her house that she lived in.
yeah.
And the HOA sent us a mail on 15, like 2 weeks after she passed away, saying there's rust on the side of the wall of the house, and I'm
Oh,
like, really, guys, really, that there. And
right.
then for me, it's there's so much, grief, and so much, do I really have to do this, these feelings of
Yeah.
like going back and putting rust aid on the rust on the side of the house,
Oh,
um
that's rough.
and that's hard. And then there's also all the contents that are inside of the house that bring up memories as well. So some people, family members, may want to be, hey, let's sell the house immediately. And
Mm-hmm.
others are like, well, this is where mom and dad live. This is where, we live together as a
Mm-hmm.
couple, where whatever it might be. It's
Mm-hmm.
all those emotions. And you may be house rich, cash poor, but you may want to hold on to those memories and emotions. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why, like you said,
Yeah.
having the conversations ahead of time and setting aside money for those specific costs are important. I'm not a life insurance salesman, but life insurance can be used for something like that. That's one of the vehicles, as well as, just cash investments and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that you keep mentioning over and over again is the energy, the purpose, the why, the spark behind what you're transferring.
Mm-hmm.
And so as families are talking about money, how should they be talking about it, the money, the transfer, before it happens? And how do they incorporate, the energy behind it? And then I'm going to, I'm thinking of my family and a number of other families. Hey, energy, that's woo woo. Just keep the house.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what do you say to that?
Mm-hmm. Mm. Okay. Um, so many things. It's such a great
I
question.
ask a lot of
Hmm.
questions
I love it.
layered in there, but
Um, okay, so yes, when I'm speaking of energy, for those who are like, I did not just get off my yoga mat, leave me alone, Wendy. kind of like, let's use the word intention. And I think that might go across the board, intention and decision making. So thinking about what is the intention? What are the decisions we can make beforehand? What are the decisions that will need support that can't be made beforehand or that will need support? And what are some of the pillars of support that can be put around those decisions? So that's what I mean by energy, but we can say intentions and decisions also, because same thing. Um, for that, um, so the question you're asking then, therefore, is how do we start talking about it? And
How do families sit down and
mhm,
physically talk about it? I mean, you said before it should
mhm,
have ideally it should happen before, so it should be
yesterday.
yesterday.
Uh-huh.
That's the sign up
Yeah.
off of the podcast. So
Yeah.
how do people have this conversation? And like you
Yeah.
said, how do they do it with energy and intention?
Ooh, okay. So I could probably talk about this for a long time. So let me pull it into a few things. Because we're talking about, first of all, knowing your own money story. So regardless of what your role in a family system is, knowing your money story can be really helpful in coming into a difficult conversation, a highly avoided conversation, which is what we're talking about here, uh, in a way that feels grounded, calm, centered, and mindful. Okay. So, understanding your own money story, what that means specifically. Lots of different money stories out there, but let's go to one that's commonly talked about, and that's scarcity. So, if you live with a lot of scarcity, then any discussion of money can poke that, kind of be like, oh, fear alert, fear alert. We're talking about money, probably going to lose it, probably don't have enough, never enough, never enough. Okay. If you're going to have that kind of conversation and you're going to try to talk about that and you're already edgy and anxious, you can kind of get a sensation of how that conversation is going to go. Right.
Hmm.
But even if you, and I don't mean you have to like have no scarcity suddenly, but just being aware of it, being like, okay, I will feel anxious when this comes up. That doesn't mean everyone else is going to feel that way. In other words, we tend to put our money story on everyone else, and that's actually rarely true. So knowing where you're coming from first, kind of knowing your own system as well. But thinking about the way I like to phrase the goal is that we want to decrease reactivity in order to increase connection to where we want to go. So first, I find it really helpful to have a conversation. We call it talk about talking about it. So you want to have a conversation and say, hey, family guys, we want to, I think it would be helpful if, could we, how could we, what would be comfortable for you? Any of those kind of phrases for us to begin to talk about money or to talk about the transfer of wealth or to talk about the management of an inheritance or just to talk about, hey, maybe we just want to talk about the fact that um, uh, mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, they're aging, and I see them age, and it brings sadness. I want to talk about that. I want to have these kind of conversations. So that's the beginning of it, is what feels comfortable. And maybe one member of the family is like, you know what, give me 2 months. I need 2 months head start before I'm ready to talk about that. Okay. Or, all right, can we talk about it here? Or can we talk about it, let's not talk about it, because you and I kind of talked a little bit about dropping the holidays into this too. Let's not talk about it between pass the potatoes and do you want some gravy on that? Like, because that's not the
So,
time and place. And it's going to be very uncomfortable. And it's also, if your goal is to have the topic avoided, that's the perfect place to talk about it. Because then everybody will be like, oh, let's not talk about that. And you'll be like, I tried, but now we get to avoid it for another year, right? So if that's your
right.
goal, that's okay. But
So
actually,
I shouldn't ask my mom who her executor is, like in between bites of turkey and stuffing.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like, wow, have you thought this through yet? Yeah, exactly. But to be able to say, maybe the next day, in passing, and then to take it in very small bites. Oh, that was a holiday meal pun not intended. Okay, but take it in small steps of saying, um, and I like to think of this as being very time sensitive. So the first conversation, especially if it's never been talked about, goes for about 5 minutes and that's it. So in other words, you're like, hey, I'd like to get this basically out in the open where we begin to think about how we want to talk about it. Okay. Then maybe a month later or, a couple of months later, assuming there's no sense of immediate clear urgency, be like, all right, I dropped the topic. Have y'all thought about how would you like to talk about it? Then when you begin to talk about it, I find that it's really powerful and empowering to say, and it's going to be time sensitive. So there's two things I really like to stress. Time sensitive, and I mean this literally with a timer on, because the importance of time sensitive money conversations is that when the timer goes off, everybody stops. It doesn't matter where you are, because that's how you build trust that we will hold to that line and that we'll come back to it. Because those are two things that we want to build trust for. Usually people think, oh, if we start talking about money, I'm going to be there all weekend. I will never, or it's a black hole. We'll never get out of it. That's very common
Mm,
and another reasons why it's avoided. So time sensitive and 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes tops is usually about all the brain can handle. This is why podcasts are usually 30 to 40 minutes. That's about all the
sorry,
brain can
listeners.
handle. No, no, no. We're in that neighborhood. Um, so it's helpful to understand that. Then you also want to only have, let's say you have a family of 4 or 5 people. You want everybody to be able to bring one question that day so that we're clear, okay, this is my question, this is your question, whatever. We'll work on answering those questions in this time frame. If we don't get to them, we will set the next meeting and then go
Mm,
forth and go forth so that everybody knows what's going to be talked about. We're avoiding surprises. We're avoiding sort of that, oh, well, if I start talking about this, I'll never get to do anything else today kind of feeling. And we're also really showing that, which is what is the truth, is money work's never done. So there's
yeah.
no wrapping this up. It's always ongoing. So you want to demonstrate that and embody that in your communication patterns.
Hmm. All right, I'm going to try to summarize. I'm
Good.
going to do my best. So I love the talking about it, setting, this is important to me. And can you say a couple of those lines, those
Hmm.
prompts one more
Yeah.
time?
Well, let me go with the one I didn't say, but now I'm thinking it'd be great. I was recently listening to the Currency of Grief podcast with Justin, and it made me think we've never talked about that in our family system. So I'd like to get it on the table, so to speak. Okay, so that's one. Or how could we talk about what would feel comfortable for us to begin to talk about this? Maybe I see granddad's aging and I would like to begin a conversation on this. I'd like to be clear on my role. Probably maybe you would like to be clear on your role. Some phrases like that. Yes.
Yeah. Nothing would make me happier than if you blame me or Wendy
Heck yeah.
about starting a money conversation
Mm-hmm.
with your family. So, talking about it. And then that conversation should be, 5 minutes or
Mm-hmm.
less. And
Mm-hmm.
then maybe down the road, as you're leading up to the bigger conversation, have you thought about this more?
Mm-hmm.
And then, can we set up some time as a family unit to talk about it, not at the Thanksgiving table,
Mm-hmm.
not as you're opening Christmas presents, um, a specific intentional time. And, that time should be wrapped, time sensitive from start to finish. So you're not, dabbling around the unimportant topics, but you're talking about what's important, where everyone can bring one question to the table. And then, if there needs to be more time, you can set another meeting
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because this work's never done.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's an example of a question that someone should bring to this type of conversation?
Mm. Example
What
of a
am I
question.
getting?
Right, right. Oh, well, okay, that brings up a good point. In the first couple of conversations, I would not talk about specific resources, not specific dollar amounts, or uh, who's getting what or anything like that. We want to have this conversation. Um, and also, a financial therapist is a great, like, this is what I mean when I say I'm a wealth transfer communication specialist, because having a therapeutic neutral third party, super powerfully helpful. So there's that. Um, some of the things to talk about at first would be, um, is there a plan in place?
Mm,
Don't need to know the plan, but just, is there a plan in place? Where is it? Literally, is it in on paper? Is it digitally? That kind of thing. So, like, is there a plan and where is it? I think are good places to start. Is there a team? In other words, is there an estate attorney? Can I meet them? Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is yes. Doesn't matter, because we're not judging the answers. We just want to begin to ask those kind of questions. Are there some
mm.
that come to your mind as well?
Yeah, and how is it impacting me? Like, what's my role in your plan?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if we have this home, what would you want to happen to it?
yeah, yeah.
That's I think
Hmm.
those are all important. Um, Given our holiday puns and many
Hmm.
people gearing up for the holidays, we know what not to do. But
Hmm.
let's say money is brought up around the Thanksgiving table or around
Hmm.
the Christmas tree. How should you navigate that?
Yeah. There's that acknowledgement and deferment kind of idea of, that's a great question. How about we talk about that tomorrow? Kind of idea. Because, yes, in some ways, there may be a sense of, hey, we're only together for these like 48 hours a year kind of idea. And there may be some time sensitivity to wanting to have the conversation. That's okay.
Hmm.
And because of that, typically then we sort of drop it into an awkward moment that, it's kind of the right as you're going walking out the door kind of moment, to be able to say, okay, I hear you. So just validate that it is a fair and important topic, and then offer an alternative time to talk about it. And then hopefully that goes okay. And the other person's like, yeah, tomorrow afternoon sounds great to me too. Where do you want to meet? Like,
Hmm.
pitch a table, kind of thing.
Makes sense.
If they persist and they're like, no, I need to talk about it right now, that kind of thing, it's still okay to say that I understand, like to validate their sense of urgency. You're like, I don't want to talk about it right now. That's okay too.
Yeah.
It's okay to say that. Um, Sometimes if they still persist, you can say something like, why don't you write down your questions and email them to me after we're finished with dinner, or something like that too.
Yeah, that's super fair.
Hmm.
That makes sense. I think that's the importance of talking about it and being intentional around it. So it
Hmm.
doesn't just come out when you're not expecting it and you're not ready to talk about an emotional topic.
Yeah. So let me talk about talking about it then, because, and this is still holiday minded, because again, there can be a sense of like, these are the only 2 days a year we get together. Okay. So it really does need to be talked about. Whoever is sort of in a maybe a guidance or leadership role in the family can send a note to people beforehand saying, hey, I know we really want to review this inheritance plan or whatever. I just want to go ahead and say, let's plan on doing it, like at a certain time, maybe Friday morning or something, where that way everybody knows it's being tended to, it's been named, it's clear, and we have a plan. That takes a lot of pressure off.
Yeah. And how do you, now we're talking about the beginning, how do you end
Hmm.
these conversations?
Oh, yeah.
20, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, very emotional, a lot of questions asked,
Hmm.
clarity, hopefully, maybe some raised voices, throughout the gauntlet, So is it, do you end it with a hug? Do you end it with a fun activity afterwards? Is it just all right, out the door, to the cars. If you
Hmm.
were to end it purposefully, intentionally with energy, what would be some of your, guidance there?
Yeah. So, how to end these kind of conversations is very important. It's probably more important than how to start them. So, I'm glad you asked that. I think in part you want to know your audience. So, let's look at a family of maybe there's 4 kids and parents, like, in other words, a mix of personalities and problem management styles. So, knowing those are all going to be tapped into during this conversation, it's really helpful to say before you start how you're going to end it. I I do literally like using a timer. Then when the timer goes off, everybody's like, okay, we're wrapping up now. Then name when the next meeting is. Like maybe it needs to be that next day. You don't, maybe you have something that's time sensitive, or maybe it can be a
Hmm.
few months later. Also, recognizing everyone's going to have had a different emotional journey during this meeting. Some people may have zoned out immediately because some people really do that when money comes up. They just haven't developed a tolerance yet for discussing it, but also they're embarrassed to say that. So it'd be, it's nice if somebody can summarize it at the end. And again, in a family system, you have people with different skill sets. Somebody probably is automatically class secretary and someone's automatically class treasurer. Like you have these different skill sets. It's okay to identify them if people are comfortable with it. Now we're talking about a connected, resourced, not highly reactive family system. So let's flip that for a disconnected, highly reactive, not resourced family system. You're not going to have these kind of meetings. You're probably going to need a mediator of some sort. So begin to investigate mediation. Mediators, financial therapists, someone who can come in, and that way y'all have made an appointment, which is super helpful. You're like, all right, next Thursday at 3, we're meeting at the mediator's office or the therapist's office or the attorney's office, and they're going to guide us through this conversation. And
Hmm.
that automatically has a beginning, middle, and an end, and someone to do a summary statement at the end. That is well worth a few $100s for most family systems that are highly reactive, under resourced, and whatever the third thing I said was. And yeah, the struggle. So,
Yeah,
mhm,
I love the capped ending, naming when the next meeting is, and obviously getting more help if you need it, getting
mhm,
somebody else involved if you need it, and then you are a family, and so hopefully there is love, connection, passion between the family, and for me, I would just love to either end it with a hug or end it with some sort of mutual. You said know your audience, so mutually
mhm.
engaging activity like a meal, like just
Sure.
going out for a walk or throwing the football or whatever it might be
Mhm,
that engages your
mhm.
family.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really helpful. But let's also remember this is statistically two of the most avoided topics. And also, how many times have we heard a couple or partnership of some sort say, yeah, we get along great. We only fight about money. So
Hmm.
even the most, and I'm saying this to bust out any shame for any family system. If you're right now, you're sitting there
You're right.
thinking that,
Yeah.
God, my family we could never do this. Um, so that doesn't mean, yeah, you're exactly right. Maybe I'll play a great game of football, but then when somebody says, you want to talk about money? Like I say this to my kids, my family, my parents, and of course, I've made my parents sit down and talk about money, and they've tolerated it really well. They'll be like, okay, I don't want to do this, but I've used all of these same sort of tactics, time sensitive, like just a couple of like I've used them in real life with my parents, um, and also with my clients, they've used them as well. So they really are powerful and helpful. But just, on the flip of that, there's no shame, no judgment. If your family system can't tolerate this, that's okay. That's why we're here to
Yeah.
help.
Yeah. Definitely. I think, like you said, it's that's why we're having this conversation. It's taboo.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody likes to talk about it, and everybody's on different ends of the spectrum, and nobody has it down perfect. So,
Mm-hmm.
and speaking of that, your quote that stood out to me. It's common for people to leave an estate plan with no clear inheritance plan. It's just been churning in my
Mm-hmm.
mind since, and the gears have been churning, and I've been, establishing an inheritance plan and what that may look like and iterating it and stuff like that over time. And so, what is the impact, the emotional or financial impact of not having an inheritance plan? And in your eyes, what should an inheritance plan look like?
Mm. Um, let's start by defining what we mean, or I'll tell you what I'm meaning when I hear the word estate plan and inheritance plan. It's
Hmm.
and Justin, tell me if this aligns with kind of what you're thinking too. But I see an estate plan as largely more a set of instructions. An inheritance plan is more like, how am I going to assimilate this into my life? How would you see the two?
Yeah, I think it's a set of instructions, and the estate plan is it's also identifying roles, people's roles and responsibilities,
Hmm.
whereas the inheritance plan is identifying the values that you want to the money or the assets or the inheritance to portray in your own life and the lives of the heirs, the inheritors.
Yeah, yeah. Coming back into the intentions, the
Yeah,
decision
exactly.
making. Yeah. And we didn't touch on this yet either, but there's also a huge identity shift when someone receives a large sum of uh, or wealth, we'll say. By wealth, the reason I keep moving around, wealth means a lot of different things to to different people. So sometimes to saying resources, because it's not always cash
Right.
or investments. It can be houses, things like that too. So um,
Businesses.
but man, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
Part two.
We haven't touched on businesses. Yeah. So an inheritance plan. You know, first of all, it's never too late to start talking about this. I just want to say that I was just reading something recently that was um, through Scott Pape, who wrote The Barefoot Investor. I don't know if you've ever read his book, but it's quite a fun look at money. He's from Australia. He um, uses a sense of humor to sort of talk to people about how to live and engage with their money. So he was giving a story about someone in their 70s who wasn't really sure what to do with X number of millions of dollars to pass on to their children who they didn't see any financial responsibility behaviors showing yet. And my thought was, okay, let's start talking about it. Let's start talking about that. And this to me is more the inheritance plan of like show them how to open an account, begin to discuss with them, like, offer these teaching moments now so that you're like, hey, here's what this can feel like. Oh, I remember when, for instance, I remember when I made my first million and what that felt like. And here
Mhm.
you're going to have 10 million. Here's what this might feel like share these stories, begin those conversations. To me, that's a lot of what inheritance is about. It's about, okay, I have this thing. What do I want? What role do I want it to play in from the giver to the receiver's life or the receiver in my life? So we're talking about identity. We're talking about um, growth, expansion, um, things like that too.
Yeah.
Whereas you're right, like the estate plan tends to be more like here's what's happening and here's gonna do what and those kind of things too. So
Yeah. I love that. So the money, it goes back to one thing you said earlier is knowing your money story. And
hmm
so, if I'm the giver, I
hmm
want to portray to my heirs what my money story is, how maybe I started from nothing and built this wealth, these resources by
hmm
myself, and how like the decisions that I've made over time and how it shaped my identity. But my heirs are completely different people. And so let's have a conversation around how it can or could shape your identity based on sort of how it shaped my identity, and are those identities aligned, or are they completely separate? And you know, it's a process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I like the idea of having something on paper, communicating the values, just talking about the story, the why, the resources, and how it shapes your identity. And some people want it to have more freedom, more security, more opportunity, to give back more to the community. We don't know what the intention is behind the inheritance
Mm-hmm.
unless we talk about it.
Yeah. And story is such a big part of that. That's why one of the things that I'm focusing on the rest of this year and next year is money story workshops and really helping um, women sit down, or men as well, or couples, like sit down and spend some dedicated time to their money story, their money timeline, and then where they want it to go. That question of now what are the next chapters? What do you want them to be like?
If people wanted to find the workshop, where could they
Mhm.
look?
Yeah, right now it is wendywrightfinancialtherapy.com, or follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn. Um, Hopping on my email list is the quickest way right now to find out about the workshops. And the one in November is going to be holiday focused. So it's really going to be
Oh,
healing
great.
our holiday money story and what that can look like, and beginning to uh, identify it first and then see what you want it to look like, so that it doesn't feel like, so often we feel like the holidays happen to us. And I want you to feel like you're happening to them.
I love that. Yeah, that's we want the holidays to happen for us, and you
Yeah.
to put your best foot forward and enjoy your time. Don't let them fly by.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this has been incredible, Wendy. I'm so grateful for this conversation. I want to put you in one final scenario to leave our audience with some key takeaways and advice. So
Okay.
let's say a 30-year-old comes to you. They just lost their dad, and that's their last surviving parent.
Mm.
They're the executor of their dad's estate, and they know they'll be inheriting $2 million. What advice would you give someone like this?
Mm. Well, first, I'm going to validate, and really be excited that they reached out, because I will say, often say this to my financial therapy clients, they're adventurers because they don't know what they're getting into. Financial therapy is still so new. So yeah, and first we're gonna pause. We're really gonna be okay pausing. And sometimes that's so relieving, because they feel a lot of pressure of like, oh my gosh, I have all this stuff. I need to make all these decisions. So we're gonna pause, try to catch your breath, tend pay attention to the healing. But then also, one of the things I try really hard to do, and this is my financial therapy approach, and my money coaching approach, is blend both the need for the emotional work and the tactical work, because sometimes we can't put off for 6 months or a year a decision about something, like things need to be decided. So helping them figure out maybe what the questions are to ask and who to ask. Often I'll role play with clients. Like, if a lot of my clients are nervous to talk to financial professionals. And so we'll role play, like, okay. And also helping them, some of the same things we just talked about, how to talk about things, um, naming one or two goals for meeting with the financial planner or the estate attorney or whoever they're meeting with.
Hmm.
Try not to do it all at once, but also applying that compassionate curiosity and zero judgment of, hey, this is a hard time, and you don't really know how it's going to shake out yet. You're just going to put one foot in front of the other right now and get through the moments. And we're going to decide, what do you want to focus on right now, which is usually safety and security and compassion. So with that, then we do some math around what provides that the most. I also try to help them think about, okay, like that whole idea of uh, what does future Wendy want to say about today? And you don't really know all the time, but what you might be able to say is, For instance, okay, I really want to know that this didn't consume me. I was still able to function and do my job or something like that. Like there may be some
Yeah.
things you're like, okay, yeah, I know this. Let's go with what you know, build a plan around it, knowing that it's going to be adjusted. But also, yeah, the reaching out for support is so powerful. And
Hmm.
that's where financial therapy comes in to where there is this safe, non-judging place where you can talk about this. And there's no like, I'm not trying to sell anything to anybody. We're just talking and doing the work. And I think that's really powerful too, because it's low pressure.
Definitely. So what I heard was thanking that person for coming to you, whether you're a professional therapist or just a friend, for
Hmm.
sharing, validating and sharing their emotions. And then I really like the idea of taking someone out of the now and putting them into the future and
Hmm.
looking back on the journey, because you have no idea when you're grieving, when you just lost someone, how that journey is going to shape out. And sometimes you're just so focused on the now, so stuck in the mud that you can't
Hmm.
look out into the future. But there is light, there is the possibility and the eventuality that you are going to make it through this. And what do you want,
Yeah.
this all to look like? And it's never going to be perfect, it's never going to go according to plan. I say, as a financial planner, the one thing I
Hmm.
can guarantee you about this financial plan is that it's going to be wrong.
See, plan's only as good as the adjustment process.
I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that takeaway, that
Hmm.
advice is so valuable. And Wendy, this conversation has been incredible. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. I'm really so glad that you brought me on and that we were able to elevate this conversation.
Of course. And I'll definitely tag your website, wendywrightfinancialtherapy.com. Join the email list. I'm a subscriber and I think it's great. I'll tag your Instagram and your LinkedIn to the show notes as well. But
Okay.
podcast family, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Currency of Grief podcast. And don't forget, it's a great day to have a great day. So go have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Currency of Grief podcast. My hope is that today's conversation brought you clarity, comfort, and even a spark to start those difficult but necessary conversations in your own life. If you found this episode helpful, it would mean the world to me if you would share it with one other person who you feel this podcast could impact. And please take a moment to leave us a 5-star review. Your review will help us reach more people who need this resource. Remember, the best time to talk about death and money was yesterday. The second best time is now. Until next time, I'm Justin Weidenfeld, your Grief Financial Officer, and this has been the Currency of Grief podcast.